Hi, I am Ashley Maxcey, and I am excited to share with you tests of inhibition as a cause of forgetting in recognition. My co-authors on this project are Becky Cutler from Vanderbilt University, Rob Nosofsky from Indiana University, and Rich Shiffrin, also from Indiana University. I'm going to begin by briefly discussing three proposed mechanisms of forgetting before focusing on inhibition for the majority of the talk. Then I will describe both retrieval and recognition-induced forgetting, which are relevant to the experiments reported here. Finally, I will describe two experiments testing the inhibition account of forgetting in recognition. The present studies were designed to provide tests for the following three mechanisms of forgetting: competition or interference, context, and inhibition. For the sake of brevity in this talk, I will focus on inhibition. We also have data speaking to the other two accounts of forgetting, which I will discuss very briefly, and Rich can address further during the Q&A period following the talk. To briefly describe how inhibition might cause forgetting, consider the following scenario. A subject holds multiple related traces in memory, such as the word cherry and the word peach. When attempting to retrieve cherry, they might incorrectly retrieve the word peach. If a cue, such as the letter C in a word stem completion task, provides feedback that peach is actually incorrect, then inhibitory mechanisms might suppress peach, reducing its strength, making it easier to retrieve the correct trace, in this case, the word cherry. Inhibition is certainly a plausible cause of forgetting, given that inhibition is everywhere in the brain. In the situation described here, inhibiting a trace even seems adaptive, increasing the probability of retrieving the desired memory. Evidence for inhibition comes from a clever paradigm introduced by Anderson, Bjork, and Bjork, demonstrating retrieval-induced forgetting following cued recall in a three-phase paradigm. To briefly describe retrieval-induced forgetting, subjects first study category exemplar pairs in an initial study phase. Then they practice retrieving a subset of the words in a practice phase. Finally, in a test phase, memory for all studied words is tested. Retrieval-induced forgetting is the finding that words related to practiced words, such as cherry in this example, are forgotten relative to a baseline of words drawn from categories that were never practiced, like golf here. Inspired by retrieval-induced forgetting, my colleagues and I have shown forgetting also occurs in a three-phase recognition paradigm, primarily with pictures. I've presented this paradigm several times at Psychonomics, so for the sake of brevity, I'll point out that the major distinctions are typically that recognition-induced forgetting uses pictures of everyday objects instead of words, and recognition tasks in the second and third phases instead of recall tasks. Importantly, forgetting of pictures also occurs following restudy in phase 2. Explicit instructions that the study subjects engage in recognition practice is not required. This is a finding that has been demonstrated in several labs and is incorporated into the present study. Here we ask whether forgetting in recognition memory is due to inhibition. In the present study, we modified the recognition-induced forgetting paradigm to ask which of the three mechanisms are driving forgetting. Due to time constraints, I'm going to describe only the key components you need to know to understand the inhibition results I'm presenting today. First, the study phase was designed to present exemplars from categories that I'm going to refer to as lists. These lists differed in several ways. For example, here you see list A is comprised of teddy bears. As you can see in the top row, these teddy bears are interleaved into other lists across the study phase and presented for 3 seconds each. Here you see that subjects were presented with 7 exemplars from the teddy bear category, numbered 1 through 7 in the bottom row. Next, teddy bears in positions 4 through 7 were repeated. And finally, 3 more teddy bears, numbered 8 through 10, are presented. Again, this order of teddy bears unfolds with other objects interleaved in between them, as shown in the top row. Following the study phase, subjects completed the test phase. The test phase consisted of speeded 2 alternative forced choice tests. 1.5 seconds was allotted to perceive the 2 pictures and make a judgment. If a subject took longer than 1.5 seconds to respond, a 4-second too slow message was presented. The speeded responses reduce the likelihood that different context cues or different decision criteria would be used for the two pictures. In addition, because all pictures were studied in spaced fashion throughout the single study phase, we hope that the participant would not use different context cues to judge the two different test pictures in the two alternative force choice. Participants were told to choose the picture more likely to have been seen in the study phase, so the choices should have reflected trace strength. The numbers underneath the test phase trials refer to trial types. Next, I will describe the three trial types that allow us to directly test inhibition. Trial type 1 compared memory for an early list A item and a late list A item. Neither of these items were repeated. They occur before and after the repetitions. The arguments for inhibition in cued recall depend on retrieving an incorrect trace and inhibiting that trace. Applying that reasoning here, only traces that already exist could be inhibited. That prediction is shown in the bottom row for bears 1 through 3. The first 3 bears should have been inhibited by the repeated bears that follow. The last 3 bears should not have been inhibited. As we accumulate knowledge and experience, it would be increasingly impossible to learn anything new. In these early versus late trial types, the inhibition account predicts that subjects would select the late bear, not the early bear. The next trial type relevant to inhibition is trial type 10, which compares memory for an early list A item to an early list B item. List B consists of a list of objects that's equated in the number of presentations to list A. On the top row, you see list A has 10 objects, 4 of which repeat, totaling 14 presentations. In the bottom row, you see list B. List B has 14 objects and no repetitions. Again, remember that all these lists are interleaved between one another. When comparing an early list A item to an early list B item, the inhibition account prediction is that subjects will select the list B item relative to the list A item, because again, the list A item should be inhibited. The key comparison is actually between this early force choice and the late force choice, which is trial type 11, which I'm going to describe next. The third trial type relevant to inhibition is this trial type 11. When comparing a late list A item to a late list B item, the inhibition account prediction is that subjects will select each item equally because late items are not inhibited. Now that I've walked you through the 3 trial types I will focus on, let's get to the results. First, we sought to rule out serial position effects. To make a valid inference about comparisons of early versus late pictures, it's necessary that there are no primacy or recency effects. Statistical tests confirmed what this figure suggests. There are no significant serial position effects that would confound the inferences from early versus late comparisons. Second, to replicate that instructions to study repeating items had the same effect as explicit instructions to recognize them, half the subjects were told to study during the first phase, and half the subjects were told to monitor for repetitions. This figure compares study versus monitoring. The diagonal shows equal performance. Statistical tests showed no significant differences between the 2 groups, so these conditions were combined for all analyses. Third, to confirm that repetitions boosted memory for repeated objects, we compared memory for a repeated object when it was paired with a non-repeated object. Subjects chose the repeated picture 66% of the time. Again, confirming that repetitions boosted memory for repeated objects, we compared memory for a repeated object when it was paired with a non-repeated object in a similar serial position from list B. Subjects chose the repeated picture 66% of the time again. Now I will turn to those 3 trial types that tested inhibition. In trial type 1, when an early item was paired with a late item, both from the category that had repetitions, those list A categories, inhibition predicts that the late item will be preferred. Subjects chose the late item on 53% of trials. This result is slightly in the direction predicted by inhibition, though small and not statistically significant. In trial type 10, When an early list A item was compared to an early list B item, inhibition predicts subjects will select a list B item. Contrary to this prediction, subjects chose the list A item 57% of the time. This significant result is opposite that predicted by inhibition if the two categories are roughly equal in strength. This result is also opposite the usual induced forgetting finding, which I will discuss later. It's hard to know if the two categories are indeed equated. Thus, the stronger test compares this result to the next result. In trial type 11, when a late list A item was compared to a late list B item, remember that inhibition predicts subjects will have no preference. But contrary to this prediction, subjects chose the list A item 58% of the time. Comparing trial types 10 and 11, remember 10 was the early comparison between A and B, and 11 is this late comparison between A and B. This late test should have shown a larger advantage than the early test if inhibition were operating, but the two are essentially equal. I show you this table of results only because I want to illustrate to you that there were many other trial types and analyses incorporated into our conclusions and model. The highlighted trials are those I presented to you today. In experiment 1, I have shown you that there was no positive evidence of inhibition. I also mentioned that there was no evidence of induced forgetting. This could have been due to the use of a two-phase design, or it could have been due to the use of the speeded two-alternative force choice tests. In experiment 2, the repetitions were moved to a middle phase such that the experiment was now a three-phase design typical of induced forgetting experiments. The first two phases of experiment 2 were essentially the same as previous studies showing induced forgetting. The third phase is what's different because of the use of that speeded two-alternative force choice. Again, for the sake of brevity, I want to briefly note that we replicated all of the findings from experiment 1 in experiment 2. So remember, experiment 2 was different because it had a three-phase design typical of induced forgetting experiments, but it was atypical in that it used the speeded two-alternative force choice tests. Again, we found no positive evidence of inhibition nor evidence of induced forgetting. This failure to find induced forgetting was also found in experiment 1, but that failure could have been due to the use of a two-phase design. The reversal of induced forgetting found here had to be due to the use of speeded two-alternative force choice, not the two-phase design. These results suggest that induced forgetting found in previous studies is due to the use of different contexts or different decision criteria to judge the two critical pictures. A model based on familiarity can show how this might work. It should be clear that induced forgetting found in the earlier three-phase recognition studies cannot be used to infer inhibition. The two-alternative force choice could not have changed inhibition because inhibition had to have taken place before the participants learned how memory would be tested. We conclude that there is either no inhibition operating in recognition paradigms or that inhibition must be quite weak. The findings from the two experiments showed effects predicted by familiarity or competition theory that I did not have time to present, such as effects of list length. In fact, we successfully fit a familiarity model to all the results, a model assuming no inhibition process. Perhaps inhibition operates only in cued recall. It's our intent to test that possibility as we move forward with this research. Thank you so much for your attention. Now, Rich is looking forward to the Q&A period.